Right now, over 100 miles east of Hawaii, a massive spinning engine of wind and warm ocean water is getting stronger by the hour. It has a name, it has an eye, and it has meteorologists from Miami to Honolulu watching every single update come in. This is Hurricane Fausto, the first hurricane of the 2026 season to reach the Central Pacific. And as of this morning, it has strengthened into a Category 2 storm with sustained winds of 105 miles per hour, sitting in warm water, under low wind shear, in almost textbook conditions for a storm to keep building. And here's the part that should get your attention. Forecasters are not ruling out Hawaii. They are telling residents, in their own words, that the risk of wind and rainfall impacts on the islands is increasing, not decreasing, increasing. So today we are breaking down exactly what Fausto is doing right now, why storms like this can explode in strength within 24 hours, what history tells us about hurricanes in Hawaii, and what happens next depending on which way the system decides to turn. No panic, no exaggeration, just the data, the forecast models, and what you actually need to know. If you live anywhere near the Pacific, the Gulf Coast, or the Atlantic seaboard, this is exactly the kind of channel you want in your subscription feed, because tropical systems do not wait for a convenient time to develop, and neither do we. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. If you've ever ridden out a hurricane, a tropical storm, or even just a bad tropical downpour, I want to hear it. And if this channel helped you understand a storm system better even once, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because when the next advisory drops, you'll be the first to know. Let's get into what's actually happening out there. As of the most recent advisory from the National Hurricane Center, Hurricane Fausto was centered roughly 1,460 miles east of Hilo, moving west near 16 miles per hour, packing maximum sustained winds of 105 miles per hour. That officially makes it a Category 2 hurricane on the Saffir-Simpson scale. Hurricane force winds extend out about 45 miles from the center, and tropical storm force winds stretch out to nearly 185 miles, which means even before the core of the storm gets anywhere close to land, its outer bands are wide enough to affect ocean conditions across an enormous stretch of the Pacific. Fausto has been trending upward for days. It started as a tropical depression, organized into a tropical storm, and climbed to hurricane strength faster than a lot of storms this season, thanks to sea surface temperatures sitting around 79 to 81 degrees Fahrenheit along its path, combined with low to moderate wind shear. For a storm engine, that is fuel and clean air, almost exactly the setup you'd draw up on a whiteboard if you wanted to build a hurricane. Meteorologists have noted that Fausto's western eye wall has started to show some erosion, but deep thunderstorm activity keeps wrapping back around the inner core, and the eye itself has looked ragged at times, then reorganized. That kind of back and forth is a sign of a storm that is fighting to hold its structure, not one that is falling apart yet. This matters because Fausto is not just some offshore curiosity. It is being tracked specifically because of where it is projected to go. A ridge of high pressure to the north is steering the storm almost due west, and if that pattern holds, current forecast guidance has Fausto passing at or near the Hawaiian Islands within the next several days. The National Weather Service office in Honolulu has already put out language that Hawaii residents should be monitoring this storm closely. And so that while Fausto is expected to weaken as it approaches, uncertainty in the track means it's too early to rule out direct impacts. Here is where a lot of people misread hurricane coverage, so let's clear it up. When forecasters say a storm is expected to weaken before arrival, that is not the same as saying the storm will have no impact. Weakening usually refers to a drop in maximum sustained wind speed as the storm interacts with cooler water, dry air, and increasing wind shear on its final approach. But a weakening hurricane can still be a very large weakening hurricane. Fausto is described by forecasters as an unusually large system, and even after center point wind speeds come down, the outer wind field, the ocean swell it generates, and the moisture it's carrying can still spread hazardous conditions across hundreds of miles. Current guidance has Fausto crossing into the Central Pacific Basin this weekend, likely still near hurricane strength before a more serious weakening trend kicks in as it approaches the islands early to the middle of next week. Some models show it dropping to a tropical storm, some show it becoming a weaker tropical cyclone, or even a remnant low by the time it's closest to land. The catch is this: confidence in the exact track is higher than confidence in the exact intensity, and Hawaii sits close enough to the southern edge of most model guidance that even a small shift south could change the entire outcome for the islands. What forecasters are confident about, and what they've said clearly, is the surf. Large, dangerous swell generated by Fausto is expected to start hitting east-facing shores of the Hawaiian Islands by late this weekend, with a high surf advisory already extended for south-facing shores. That means rip currents, dangerous shore break, and hazardous ocean conditions arriving well before any question of the storm's core making landfall is even settled. If you are anywhere near those coastlines this weekend, that swell is not a maybe. It is already forecast, already confirmed, and already something beachgoers need to plan around. This is a good moment to explain a term you're going to keep hearing every hurricane season: Rapid intensification. Meteorologists define it very specifically. A storm undergoes rapid intensification when its maximum sustained winds increase by at least 35 miles per hour within a 24-hour period. It sounds almost unbelievable that a storm can gain that much strength in a single day, but it happens more often than most people realize, and it is one of the hardest things in all of meteorology to forecast accurately. The ingredients are almost always the same. Warm ocean water, ideally down to a decent depth, not just a thin, warm surface layer that gets churned up and disrupted the moment the storm passes over it. Low wind shear, meaning the winds at different altitudes above the storm are blowing in similar directions and similar speeds, so the storm's vertical structure doesn't get torn apart. High atmospheric moisture, so the storm has plenty of fuel to keep generating the towering thunderstorms that wring its eye. And an already well-organized inner core, because a storm that already has a tight, defined center is far more efficient at converting warm ocean energy into wind speed than a sprawling, disorganized system. When all of those factors line up at once, a tropical storm can jump a full category or more in less than a day. This is exactly the phenomenon that has made hurricane forecasting so much more complicated in recent years, because a storm sitting offshore, looking unremarkable on Monday, can be a major hurricane by Tuesday night. It's also why coastal communities are told, again and again, not to make their preparedness decisions based on the storm's current strength, but based on its worst-case potential strength given the environment it's moving through. Fausto's environment right now is what forecasters would call marginal but supportive. The warm water's there, the shear is currently low to moderate. That's part of why it climbed to Category 2 as quickly as it did. But models show that environment turning more hostile in the next couple of days, with dropping mid-level humidity and increasing westerly shear working against the storm as it heads toward the central Pacific. In plain language, the atmosphere is expected to start fighting Fausto instead of feeding it. Whether that fight wins out before the storm reaches Hawaii or after is exactly the question this storm is going to answer for us in real time. Fausto is not happening in isolation. It is arriving in the middle of a Pacific hurricane season that forecasters have flagged as unusually active, driven in large part by a strengthening El Niño pattern. El Niño refers to a periodic warming of sea surface temperatures across the central and eastern tropical Pacific, and when it sets up, it tends to load the dice in favor of more numerous and often stronger eastern Pacific hurricanes, while simultaneously suppressing storm formation over in the Atlantic basin. That's exactly the split we've been watching play out this year. The Atlantic has been comparatively quiet, with forecasters at Colorado State University projecting one of the least active Atlantic seasons in over a decade. Meanwhile, the eastern and central Pacific have been anything but quiet, and Fausto becoming the season's first hurricane to threaten the central Pacific basin fits that pattern precisely. This is worth understanding because it changes how you should think about hurricane risk depending on where you live. If you're along the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic seaboard this year, the seasonal odds are actually running below average, though even a quiet season can still produce a devastating individual storm, so preparedness never gets to take a year off. If you're in Hawaii or anywhere touched by the Central Pacific Basin, this year's setup is the opposite. Warmer water, a supportive atmosphere, and a documented tendency for more eastern Pacific storms to survive the long trip west without falling apart before they arrive. Here's a fact that surprises a lot of people outside the islands. Direct hurricane landfalls in Hawaii are historically rare. Not because the islands are somehow protected, but because of geography and typical steering patterns. Most eastern Pacific hurricanes that reach the central Pacific tend to pass north or south of the main Hawaiian islands, weakening as they move over progressively cooler water the further west and north they travel. The most recent storm to make a direct landfall on any of the islands was Tropical Storm Linda, which crossed Molokai back in August of 2024. Before that, you have to go back to September of 1992 to find a hurricane making a direct hit, when Hurricane Iniki struck the island of Kauai as a powerful Category 4 storm. Iniki is still the benchmark storm that Hawaii emergency planners use when they talk about worst-case scenarios. It caused billions of dollars in damage, devastated large sections of Kauai, and remains the most powerful hurricane recorded to hit the state directly. The reason it's brought up so often isn't nostalgia. It's a reminder that the island's typical luck with storm tracks is exactly that, typical, not guaranteed. Rare does not mean impossible. And the entire reason meteorologists watch every eastern Pacific storm that forms is because any one of them could be the exception that breaks the pattern. That's the tension sitting underneath the Fausto forecast right now. The historical odds favor the storm sliding north of the islands and continuing to weaken, which is exactly what the majority of computer models are currently showing. But Hawaii's National Weather Service office has been explicit that the track guidance keeps clustering near the southern edge of the model spread, close enough to the islands that forecasters are unwilling to simply wave this one off as a non-event. When your forecast office starts using language like, the risk of impacts is increasing days out from a possible approach, that is measured professional caution, not hype, and it deserves to be taken seriously. It's also worth putting today's storm tracking in context against what Hawaii had available in 1992. Back then, satellite imagery was far less frequent, computer forecast models were nowhere near as sophisticated, and residents often had far less lead time to prepare compared to today's forecasting infrastructure. Today, the National Hurricane Center issues detailed advisories multiple times a day, complete with 5-day cone forecasts, wind speed probability maps, and storm surge modeling. The National Weather Service in Honolulu is already issuing specific guidance days ahead of any potential approach, tracking everything from projected wind field size to expected surf heights on specific coastlines. This is the same lesson that shows up again and again whenever you compare how different regions handle similar storms. It's not about whether the ocean produces a dangerous system. The ocean does that regardless of preparation. It's about how much lead time, infrastructure, and public communication exists before that system arrives. Hawaii in 2026 has vastly more warning capability than Hawaii in 1992. And that gap is exactly why officials are already talking about Fausto publicly days before any potential arrival, instead of residents finding out only once the storm is bearing down on the coastline. Let's walk through where this can actually go, because a responsible forecast has to account for a range of outcomes, not just one dramatic possibility. In the most likely scenario based on current model consensus, Fausto continues to weaken as it crosses into the Central Pacific, drops to tropical storm strength or lower, and passes to the north of the main Hawaiian Islands, delivering large surf, some rain bands, and gusty trade winds, but no direct landfall and no widespread destructive impact. This is the outcome most computer models currently favor, and it lines up with the historical tendency for these systems to slide north. In a secondary scenario, the storm track shifts slightly south from current guidance, or weakening slows down more than expected, bringing a stronger and closer pass to the islands with more significant wind, heavier rainfall, and potentially damaging surf across a wider stretch of coastline. This scenario would likely trigger tropical storm watches or warnings for at least parts of the state, and is exactly the kind of shift forecasters are watching for over the next several advisory cycles. In the least likely but still non-zero scenario, given how uncertain long-range tropical forecasting remains, the storm maintains more strength than currently projected and tracks close enough to produce a more serious direct impact, similar in spirit, though not necessarily in scale, to what Iniki delivered in 1992. Forecasters are not currently predicting this outcome, and it sits well outside the main body of model guidance. But it's the reason meteorologists never tell residents to fully stand down until a storm has clearly passed or dissipated, because tropical systems have a well-documented history of deviating from their most probable forecast track. If you're watching this from anywhere in the Hawaiian Islands, here's the practical version of everything above. You do not need to be in panic mode today. Current official guidance does not call for evacuations, and no coastal watches or warnings are in effect at this point. What you should be doing is treating this the way Hawaii Emergency Management always recommends treating any developing tropical system in the Pacific. Use the next several days productively. Check that your household has enough water, non-perishable food, medication, flashlights, and batteries to comfortably last a week without needing to restock, since island supply chains can be disrupted quickly if a storm does end up approaching. Know your evacuation zone if you live in a coastal or flood-prone area, because that information takes minutes to look up now and can be nearly impossible to research calmly once a storm warning is already posted. If you have travel plans to the islands in the coming week, stay in contact with your airline and accommodations, and keep an eye on official National Weather Service updates rather than relying on secondhand summaries. And if you're planning to be anywhere near east-facing or south-facing shorelines this weekend, take the high surf advisory seriously, even if the storm itself stays far offshore, because dangerous rip currents and shore break from a distant hurricane's swell have injured and killed people in Hawaii before, completely independent of whether the storm ever gets close to land. If you're watching this from the mainland United States, the Gulf Coast, or anywhere along the Atlantic, Fausto itself is not your storm. But the pattern behind it is worth understanding regardless of where you live, because the same rapid intensification dynamics that are fueling Fausto in the Pacific apply just as much to storms forming in the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic Basin. Warm water, low shear, high moisture. Those three ingredients don't check which ocean they're in before they start building a hurricane. This season already produced an earlier storm that brought heavy rainfall and flash flooding to parts of the southeastern United States. A reminder that even in a seasonally quieter Atlantic year, individual storms can still cause serious localized damage. The lesson from every tropical season, regardless of which basin is more active, is the same one meteorologists repeat constantly and residents too often ignore until it's too late. Have your emergency plan ready before a storm exists, not after one is named. Here's the thing about tropical systems that makes them genuinely fascinating from a science standpoint, and genuinely dangerous from a human standpoint. They are, at their core, heat engines. They take warm ocean water, convert that thermal energy into wind and rain through a remarkably elegant physical process, and release it in a form that can flatten coastlines, or, just as easily, curve harmlessly out to open ocean and dissipate without anyone on land ever needing to evacuate. The exact same storm, under a slightly different steering pattern, a slightly different pocket of dry air, a slightly different wind shear alignment, can produce wildly different outcomes for the people in its path. That is exactly why forecasters talk in probabilities and cones of uncertainty instead of definitive predictions, and it's exactly why the responsible way to cover a storm like Fausto is not to scream that disaster is guaranteed, and not to dismiss it as nothing to worry about either. It's to explain clearly what the data currently shows, what the range of realistic outcomes looks like, and what you can control regardless of which outcome ends up happening. You cannot control whether Fausto curves north or drifts south. You cannot control whether the atmosphere turns hostile a day earlier or a day later than current models expect. What you can control is whether your household has water, whether you know your evacuation zone, and whether you're checking official advisories instead of relying on secondhand panic from social media. Over the next several days, expect the National Hurricane Center and the Central Pacific Hurricane Center to keep issuing updated advisories, likely every 6 hours, as Fausto crosses into Central Pacific waters, and forecasters get a clearer read on both its track and its intensity trend. The key details to watch for in each new update are simple. Is the forecast track shifting north, holding steady, or drifting south? And is the storm weakening on schedule or holding on to strength longer than current models expect? Those 2 questions will tell you almost everything you need to know about how this plays out for Hawaii. We will be tracking every update as it comes in, because that's exactly what this channel exists to do. Real storms, real data, explained clearly, without manufacturing drama that isn't there and without downplaying risk that is. If you want to stay ahead of this story instead of catching it secondhand once it's already trending, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because the next advisory could shift this entire forecast, and I'll have it broken down for you the moment it drops. Before you go, drop a comment and let me know. Have you ever been through a hurricane, a tropical storm, or a close call with one? Where were you, and what was it like watching the forecast change in real time? I read every single one of these, and they genuinely shape what we cover next. If this video helped you understand what's actually happening with Fausto, do me a favor and hit that like button. It costs you nothing, and it helps this reach the people who need to see it before the weekend surf and the next advisory drop. Stay safe out there, keep an eye on the official updates, and I'll see you in the next one.